Welcome to Unifying Science and Consciousness, a rational spirituality crash course. So, I don't want you to take anything on faith, and I don't ask you to believe anything without evidence or thinking it through. Let's have a look at the story of science and consciousness and how we can unify it. What's coming up? So now we'll be talking about unifying science and consciousness. We'll be doing that by looking at the story of science, the story of consciousness, and possible ways to unify the two. Later, in the next lectures, we'll be looking at the demonstrable power of free will. Are we trapped in the matrix? And we'll be looking at exceptional conscious experiences. All of those titles may elicit a bit of a response from you, and I just want to reassure you that this will be a very rational look into these things. We'll be looking at evidence for and against certain claims, and I don't want to be wishy-washy about anything. When we come to the demonstrable power of free will, I will be giving you a rock-solid argument as far as I can see, and I'm very happy to get any feedback if you feel there are any errors in there. So put your thinking caps on and let's dig in. So we start with the story of science, which is an advanced particle theory. The earliest records from Democritus of ancient Greece, so we're talking about 470 to 370 BC, he postulated the idea of atomos, which became atoms. He had the notion that the world could be reduced down to irreducible particles that make up all things, which is astonishing because that's a very long time ago that this whole idea really took root. But it bore out to be true. As this idea has developed with various experiments and investigations and results and a lot of hard work from dedicated people who've set their intention to understand more about the world, and they've succeeded, we've come to the standard model of particle physics, which got finalised in the 1970s, where we basically have up quarks, down quarks, electrons, and we can pretty much make all of regular matter out of those three things. There are other particles, second and third generation particles, and there are force-carrying particles like gluons, because we have to have a certain number of forces to make this whole toolbox, this whole conception work. Things like the weak force, the strong force, electromagnetism. We need all that. So 17 particles, including the Higgs, in the standard model of particle physics. And that gives us our explanation of how the world works in modern times. I was going to call this the advanced balls theory because it's a popular conception that particles are just tiny balls. You know, if you see the Big Bang Theory and you see a picture of an atom, it's tiny balls with other little tinier balls, which are the electrons orbiting the atomic nuclei. Not actually how it works, but it's how it's imagined. So we think of everything as being made of tiny balls. And I did want to poke a bit of fun, but it's not really the case. You know, physicists don't really think that things are made of tiny balls. They think that things are made of point particles, which are dimensionless particles. They don't exist as having spatial dimensions of width and breadth and height. They exist in points of space, and they have fields of effect. So if I push on the table, I'm not actually making contact with tiny balls in the table and tiny balls in my hand. It's electrostatic repulsion. There's no contact. And this gives us the idea of the point particle. Of course, there's a problem with point particles, and the problem with point particles, it was really cracked open in the 1920s with Bohr's and Heisenberg's collapsing wave function in quantum mechanics. So we now have an advanced wave theory. Now, it was speculated that there were waves and particles beforehand, and there was some uncertainty as to whether light might be a particle or a wave. With quantum mechanics, it looks like it's both, and that's deeply confusing. There are some properties of light that seem to be wave-like, and there are some properties of light that seem to be particle-like. How can we make sense of this? The double-slit experiment is a very interesting experiment that dives into this, and I'm not going to cover it in depth here. I heartily recommend that you check it out and thoroughly investigate it, because it's very interesting. It gives us a notion that we can't just see the world in terms of particles. That the advanced particle theory on its own is not enough. So we start off with the idea of a collapsing wave function. And loosely speaking, what we're saying here is that there are many possible futures as to how the universe could turn out, but it appears that the universe collapses into one of those particular possibilities when we make a measurement, when we make an observation. And this has led to a lot of mystical talk around quantum mechanics, fueled in part by ideas from von Neumann, very intelligent man, who postulated that there may be a need for some sort of extra physical factor. So this is a major physicist involved in quantum mechanics of the day, suggesting that our conventional understanding of physics may not be enough to explain collapse. So, in this notion, we need something to take the possible to the actual. And unfortunately, because everything's made up of the possible, how could something that exists only as a possibility cause the collapse of possibility to actuality? It's confused a lot of people. Why does observation cause collapse? So now we get to Hugh Everett's Many Worlds Quantum Mechanics. And this is a different interpretation. And he comes up with this in 1957. And what he tries to do is solve the problem of why we should have a wave function that collapses. And he does it in a very interesting way. He suggests that all of these different possible futures aren't just possibilities that are collapsing, but that they all happen. And it's only from our subjective point of view that it appears that they haven't. That we are duplicated when there are multiple possibilities, but when we look from one of those particular worlds, we don't see the other worlds. And it looks really good. If you take the idea of Schrodinger's cat as a thought experiment, which is that we can have a box that we put a radioactive atom in, and that will or will not have decayed. It's a quantum mechanical event. We measure that with a detector, and if it decays, we release a poison and we kill the cat. Which is a terrible way to treat cats. But it was a thought experiment. You know, you don't actually have to harm any cats. There's another problem with cats. I mean, a cat's not going to make a measurement. Are cats not observers in their own right? Well, let's sweep those concerns under the rug and let's just carry on with the thought experiment anyway. So, it was considered absurd that the cat should be both alive and dead until you open the box to look. But that's what quantum mechanics seem to be suggesting. That's the way that we look at it in a collapsing wave function view, where things are all possible, but then when you look, the possibility collapses into an actual state. Everett says, no, this is all wrong. The way that we need to think about Schrodinger's cat is that we ourselves, as human beings, we get duplicated into many worlds too. So, when we have Schrodinger's cat in a box, we have an alive cat in one universe, a dead cat in another universe, and you get duplicated into both. You've just got entangled with the system, by the time that you make a measurement, that subjective experience of being you is just in one particular one of those quantum many worlds, and it sees the history that that world has. There's worlds where the cat's alive, there's worlds where the cat's dead, and there's worlds where there's different possibilities of all the things that you did. The point being here that we've now removed this requirement to have possibility collapsing into actuality. At least we thought we have. A lot of people who promote this view, like Sean Carroll, who's a very staunch proponent of it, don't seem to realise that they're kicking the observer can further down the road. You see, we still need to explain why, as conscious observers, we experience a classical world if everything's truly quantum mechanical. We haven't explained why it looks to us like the world is made of particles if in fact it's made of waves. We haven't explained that. We've just knocked it down the road. We've swept it away to a place where it's less obvious. So there's a very good open question as to whether many worlds quantum mechanics has really achieved anything at all. Arguably, it's a helpful, different way of interpreting the information, and I'm all for those, let 1,000 flowers bloom and all that. But has it really added to anything to us? Is it really giving us something that would make it more valuable than the idea of everything being possibility? As far as I can see, that's an open question. And that's pretty much where we get to with the story of science. We've got advanced particle theory. We've then realised that we have to consider waves as well. We can't make everything work just with particles alone. And we have a lot of confusion as to what's going on in the world and our place in it as observers. And that's the story of science to date. So now we move to the story of consciousness. So if we look far enough back into our own history, or we look at isolated tribes of humans that have been relatively untouched by civilization unfolding around them in the rest of the world, what we see is a mentality of spirit or consciousness being everywhere. So we went through a phase of spirit being everywhere, and we call this animism. In the modern mind, this is very much like anthropomorphizing everything. I have a spirit. Okay, I'm not quite sure what that is beyond consciousness. That's fine. The river has a spirit. The woods have a spirit. The animals have spirits. It's a view where it feels like something to be everything, and consciousness is everywhere. And it's a view that, over time, people move away from, or tend to move away from, I should say. As things develop, we go to a phase where consciousness comes from many entities, but those are more concentrated sources, and we call this polytheism. And then we contract this further still, as I'm sure you can see where I'm going at this point. Then we get to a phase where consciousness really comes from just one entity, and we have monotheism. Now, one of the really interesting things about monotheism is it really speaks to us as like a supreme parental archetype. So all the feelings that you have associated with having a mother and a father, they kind of can get projected onto this giant consciousness that's responsible for all things, which is why you have God the Father, or God the Mother, depending on the sort of monotheism that you're into, I suppose. I'm not actually sure how many monotheistic religions there are that have a female god, but it's worth putting in there. It's a parental archetype. It's the archetype of all the things that we would like our parents to be, which adds a very interesting dimension to monotheism. So moving on with the story of consciousness, now we have a clash with science. Whether we have René Descartes' dualism of 1637 or Henry Bergson's Elan Vital of 1907, we have a problem. We have matter and we have consciousness, we have mechanisms, and we have feelings. We have the world as it appears to be in mechanistic forms of physics, chemistry and biology, and all the understanding behind that, the stuff that we want to investigate in science. And we have the stuff that the church has typically had the domain over, spirit and what it is to be, and feeling and consciousness, and how we should treat each other. René Descartes' dualism is in 1637 is really probably the time that all this started to happen. And Henry Bergson, obviously in 1907, that's quite a long time afterwards, but the idea is still there in another sort of form. Descartes thought that the mind and the body were fundamentally separate things that interacted with each other. Henry Bergson proposed the idea of a fluid, or a sort of elan vital, a life force that makes ordinarily inanimate matter animate. It all revolves around the idea of consciousness playing a role in the universe that we don't understand, but acknowledging that. Now, as we advanced our science, it started to look more and more like that we really didn't need consciousness, we didn't need spirit, we didn't need an elan vital, we didn't need dualism. It looks a lot like we can just go from physics to chemistry, to biology, to neurology, to brains, to the behaviour of people, and really maybe that's all we really need to explain. Maybe there isn't anything more to consciousness than the self-report of consciousness. That, as crazy as it might sound, that maybe we don't even need to think of feelings as being real, or suffering as being real. It's just a report from a brain that is doing things mechanistically, much like a computer would say things if you told it to. It behaves in a particular way. It's been shaped by evolution instead of being written by a software developer, but there is no spirit. There is no consciousness, and nobody epitomizes this particular worldview in the current time better than Daniel Dennett, who is an illusionist. I don't mean he's a conjurer, I don't mean that he does stage magic. He believes in philosophical illusionism, which shouldn't be confused with free will illusionism, and can easily be. So there's two sorts of illusionism in philosophy circles. One of them is the illusion of free will, one of them is the illusion of consciousness, and we're really talking about Daniel Dennett's illusionism, the belief that consciousness isn't really real. It's just an illusion. He tackles this in his book Consciousness Explained, which upset a lot of people because he just felt like he was explaining it away. So after this rather distressing phase of our exploration of the story of consciousness, things are turning around. Academics, philosophers are moving away from the idea that consciousness isn't real into other ideas that we'll be coming to. So we're moving away from a phase of thinking that consciousness isn't real, and we're moving towards, and we're in some ways already in, a stage where instead of saying it's not there, we say we don't understand it. And I think it's one of the most healthy things that we've done in philosophical terms for a while. And I'm hoping that there's a very exciting future that is unfolding within my lifetime. I'm hoping that we're actually making progress towards is some, even if it's a tiny little bit of an understanding of consciousness, that we can get there, that we can move from completely not understanding it to understanding it just a little bit, and just how exciting that story will be. So now let's move on to possible ways to unify science and consciousness. So we'll start with implicit or explicit weak emergence, also known as illusionism. So we've already touched on this a bit with the no consciousness phase or the no spirit phase and talking about Daniel Dennett, but it's worth we dig into this. It's worth that we dig into this a bit further, so we will. So the major criticism of this that you'll probably notice first and foremost is that this is a dismissal of subjective experience. It's not really a unification. So with weak emergence, what we're really saying is that simple behaviours at a large enough scale, and if they're just right, will give us emergent phenomena. But those emergent phenomena are really just complex behaviours coming from simple behaviours. It's sort of like there's a game of life in software where you can create very simple rules and then you can see complex patterns emerging from those rules. And it's kind of the same principle. The idea being that water being wet is an emergent property of the water molecule. An individual molecule of water isn't wet. It takes a crowd, it takes a larger, certain critical mass of water molecules for them to become wet. You could say that nuclear fission is an emergent property of uranium as well. You need a critical mass of uranium for a chain reaction to start occurring. These are things where their ultimate complex behaviour can be described and can be completely accounted for, as far as I know, from the simpler behaviour. But from an outside point of view, you wouldn't necessarily expect that behaviour because it's sort of hidden away. It only sort of happens at these larger scales. And this really is weak emergence. So how does this apply to consciousness? Well, weak emergence is the idea that all that we really need to explain is your behaviour. All that we really need to do is explain why people behave the way they do, why they act the way they do, why they talk the way they do. We don't need to explain an inner life. We just need to explain why people talk about an inner life. In consciousness, this is the meta problem of consciousness, as popularised by David Chalmers. It's the notion of, well, why do we talk about consciousness? Let's move on. So this really is something where we need to make a distinction between behaviour and feeling. Now, I appreciate that feelings do lead to behaviours, but that's not what I'm getting at. There is a distinction we can make here. You feeling a particular way is a felt sense. It's a subjective conscious experience. In a completely behavioural world, we don't need that subjective experience. We don't need the felt sense. We can reduce you down to a mechanism. We can say, well, it's your brain that made you do it. It's your biology that made you do it. It's just physics that makes everything happen. There's no you. There's no conscious entity that's behind your eyes making decisions, feeling things. This is a very bizarre view because in weak emergence, when it's really, truly and properly followed, people don't really have feelings. There is just the report of them. It's quite a bizarre way of looking at the world, in my view. But we have examples of this sort of thinking being used. We have James Ladyman. And I'm not saying it's a conscious thing. I'm not saying that this is deliberately done. But there is a conflation and a confusion. It sometimes looks like a bait and switch, but I don't want to attribute any malice behind it. We take something like, well, how do you explain feelings then? How would you talk with someone who believed in weak emergence and how would you challenge them? You might say, well, how do you explain feelings? And what would they say? Well, they would say that all you really need to explain is why people report feelings. We don't need to have a supernatural entity or a consciousness that actually experiences feelings. We can talk about people experiencing feelings purely in terms of behaviour. And any appeal to physics is kind of something that's appealing to behaviour-only ways of looking at the world, because physics is a system of behaviour. When we look at the equations for physics, we're only really getting at behaviours. We're not trying to say how atoms feel. We're not trying to say that the universe is conscious. We're only talking about, if I smash this particular particle into this particular particle, what's going to happen? If I drive down the road at 30 miles an hour and someone's cycling at 20 miles an hour, we both pass a particular point, yada, 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 you get the idea. It's the mathematics of behavioural relationships. We're not expecting simple behaviour or complex behaviour to actually produce something distinctly different. We're not expecting it to produce consciousness, we just don't think that consciousness is real. That's why it's illusionism. James Ladyman is the example that I'll cite in the Panpsychism video that I'll give you a link to in the description. And it's worth trying to understand what's going on there with the behaviour versus feelings distinction. This is an incredibly important point. When I have talked with people who oppose what I believe in a nice, friendly manner, the thing that makes me feel like a crazy religious believer, although I am irreligious, or that's how I identify, is the notion that it feels like something to be me. I believe I exist. And I understand the behavioural world, in as far as saying, I understand that in science we understand everything in terms of behaviour. Everything is charted and measured objectively, we're just looking at behaviour. Behaviour is the only thing that we need to worry about. But to me, when confronted with that view, I say no. No. Subjectivity, what it feels like to be me, is also a thing that's distinct and different from behaviour. It's an incredibly important point. In the weak emergent view, also known as illusionism, consciousness doesn't affect reality because reality is only the behaviour of physics. So how do we test this? How do we know if someone's got this particular view or not? Well, I would put it to you that a sincerely held belief that consciousness is merely an illusion should mean that an individual is comfortable stepping into a destructive transporter in principle. So obviously, we don't have teleporters or transporters right now, but we can imagine as part of a thought experiment that in the future, maybe we've got a colony on Mars and we can have a transporter here, a transporter on Mars, and you will be duplicated from your current location precisely, absolutely precisely, and you'll be replicated at the remote location and destroyed at the original, right? So if all this happens very quickly and it seems instantaneous, as far as you're concerned, you've moved from A to B. That's what it looks like. Now, this is the idea of a destructive transporter, and if you just sketch it out quickly like that, it seems okay. I know that in Star Trek they used a little adjustment, and the adjustment was that rather than destroying the original, along with the information as to how to recombine it, would be turned into energy, flown across the universe, and then will be reintegrated at the remote location. Because I think if people feel like they're made of the stuff that they actually started out with, they feel more like themselves. But that's off on a tangent. We're talking about a destructive transporter, one that just literally copies you, but does it so sort of in a seamless way. Now, for most of us, we can imagine bringing that remote transporter on Mars to the other side of the room. And we can imagine that if we can copy you and destroy you, that we could alter the timing. We could copy you first, give you 10 seconds, and then destroy the original, which would give you just enough time to watch a copy of you emerge on the other side of the room before you realised that you were going to die. Right, so that's the problem, isn't it? When we look at it like that, then weak emergence doesn't work. You are more than your behaviour. But if you really sincerely believe that weak emergence is true and that illusionism is true and that there is no real thing that is consciousness, then where could your objection lie? If you're just behaviour, then duplicating you and destroying the original is the same as moving you from A to B. And that's why, if someone really, not just intellectually, but emotionally, properly, if they properly believe that weak emergence is true, they shouldn't mind getting into that destructive transporter. And the rest of us can go, ooh, rather you than me. So, compatibility. What can we say this particular view is compatible with? Well, it's compatible with physicalism. So, this is distinct from physics. Physics is bloody marvellous, and I love physicists, and they're wonderful, and the work that they do so that we can understand our view of reality, and we can have fancy technology, and computers, and phones, and televisions, aerospace, and Concords, and rockets, and the list goes on. I love the modern world, and we need physics for that. Physics is invaluable to us as a human species, whereas physicalism is a distinctly different beast. Physicalism is the idea that physics is the only thing that's real, the only thing that's really true. So, the problem that we have with physicalism is that physics was only ever about behaviour. So, physicalism only really believes that behaviour is a thing. Let's have a look more about that. I mean, we've obviously covered the behaviour versus feelings distinction already, but we're moving something. We've kind of got this idea of weak emergence now, so let's consider strong emergence. So, strong emergence is often just implicit. We have implicit strong emergence, and you might say, why don't people often come out with explicit strong emergence? The reason for that is it sounds a little bit crazy if you really think about it too much. So, as an exercise, we'll do just that, and then you'll see what I'm getting at. In strong emergence, it's not just a question of water being wet. We're not just trying to get complex behaviour from simple behaviour, something that I think we can all agree is certainly true. We're asking for something more. In strong emergence, we're sort of saying that the universe is just physical, it's just behaviour. And it's just behaviour everywhere, right? It's just physics, it's physics playing out. And then it's chemistry, but chemistry is just emergent from physics, so that's fine. And it's like that for a long time. There's no consciousness, no feeling for billions of years. And then you have to take your pick. Is it nervous systems? Is it some aspect of life? Or is it brains? Billions of years into the universe's runtime, we have to have something new pop into existence. Poof, consciousness appears. It wasn't there before, but now it is. This is really interesting as an idea. So how do we test this? How do we know if someone is leaning towards strong emergence? It's a really interesting way of testing this. If you're someone who's really into the idea of strong emergence, what you will tend to believe is that consciousness stops existing at death. You see, you acknowledge the fact that there is consciousness and that somehow this has come about from brains, and people tend to believe that sometime after conception, consciousness just kind of poof, exists. It just comes into existence, right? I'm not quite sure how or where, but this entirely new thing that's not just behaviour, it's not just simple behaviour going to complex behaviour, it's not that kind of emergence, it's something entirely new, a different category of stuff that just poof, pops into existence. And so it's only logical that if you do believe that consciousness pops into existence after conception, that you should believe that it stops existing at death. It's just logical. It's, one suggests to the other. So if you really want to believe, if people believe that consciousness pops into existence at birth, it's easiest to see that when they believe that it stops existing at death. So I've already gone into the criticism of this a bit, but it's worth just really hammering this one home. Entities, phenomena are genuinely created or destroyed. It's not just a change of form. And this is completely out of character with the universe as we know it. If we look at quantum field theory, which is something that I didn't feel was entirely appropriate for the story of science, because it's not a level of detail that we needed to go into at that particular point, then the leading ideas for what the universe really is sort of a collection of fields. So in that concept, there's not really separate physical objects as you see around you. That's somewhat of an illusion. These are all forms on a canvas. They're disturbances in a field. So nothing really comes into and out of existence. This is all just changing of form. And really, strong emergence cuts against all of that narrative and says consciousness wasn't there before and now it is. And we're not just talking about behaviour, we're talking about subjectivity. So let's move on to the more promising ways of looking at this. Panpsychism. Pan as in throughout, and psychism, psyche, mind. So we have mind throughout. So there's a couple of different main ways that we can look at panpsychism. Now we've got to understand that panpsychism is a very broad term. It's not very specific, and it doesn't necessarily say very much other than mind is throughout the universe. This causes a lot of confusion. Some people have very specific understandings of what panpsychism is. So let's just break it down into the two broad categories. We've got micropsychism, where the smallest elements of the universe have some degree of subjectivity or proto-subjectivity. They have some sort of experience, and what we have to do then with micropsychism is say how all these small tiny experiences could get combined in the brain to form one coherent single conscious experience that we have as human beings. So that's the combination problem. Okay, well, let's have a look at a different way of looking at this. Rather than going from the ground up, let's go from the top down. If we look at the top down, we'll be making an assertion that the universe as a whole has some sort of consciousness. And to get consciousness at the human level, instead of having to glue stuff together, we have to divide stuff. So we have to say, how is it that the human brain takes a piece of that universal consciousness and isolates it for its own use? That's really the problem that we have to solve there with cosmopsychism. It's my personal favourite, but that shouldn't mean anything to you. It's not really an intellectual comment, is it? How do we test? So, an individual who believes that consciousness is all pervasive in some fashion is a panpsychist. Claimed compatibility. Now, this is an interesting one. I've used compatibility for the others, but this is claimed. It's looser. Because panpsychism is a very loose term, then the claimed the compatibility it has depends on certain parameters as to how you define panpsychism. But it's potentially compatible with animism, polytheism, and even monotheism. So then we get to the major criticism of panpsychism. This is a good one. It's an interesting one. In fact, I'm just give me a moment. How is that conscious? How is a rock? Well, it's obviously a stone. But how can a stone or a rock be conscious? It can't. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's impossible. Obviously, panpsychism is a load of rubbish, and I should go back to watching atheist YouTubers who insist on strong emergence. I mean, I should, because how can a rock be conscious? What a bunch of new age claptrap. Well, hold the phone a bit there, right? let's calm down. How can a rock be conscious? Well, we've got a problem here. You see, let's take your brain. There are certain parts of your brain that are generating your conscious experience. Now, I wouldn't go as far as to say they're generating your consciousness. That's quite a distinction and an important one at that. But the sense of a single conscious subjective self, as illusory or not as it may be, your brain is creating that, or it certainly looks that way. So if we just take the parts of the brain that are doing that, we could divide that set of brain areas up into different parts. But each of those different parts wouldn't be having a subjective conscious experience. They're parts in a larger system that's creating a conscious subjective experience, right? You kind of need all of your brain to create that experience, although there are certain parts of it that are obviously interfacing with it. What am I trying to say here? The rock can be a part of a system. It doesn't have to have consciousness in its own right. And even if you wanted to go for micropsychism, then all of the individual atoms that comprise this rock might be having a very, 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 very simple conscious experience, whereas the rock in itself is not. And we should dig into that further, because how can atoms have conscious experience? This is the problem that many people face. They conflate. They think that consciousness is what it is to be human, that they ascribe human qualities, cognition, thought, maybe vision, hearing, something like that. They think of these things as aspects of consciousness, where they might not be. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I don't have a visual field and that I can't hear things and that those things don't exist in my consciousness, but that doesn't have to be the only definition of consciousness. So for me, I like to reduce what consciousness could be. So we can imagine, just as a thought experiment, I mean, I don't wish anyone any ill, but we can imagine not being able to see, we can imagine not being able to hear. You're still conscious. You can have locked-in syndrome where people can't respond and they're still conscious. It still feels like something to be them. So we don't need any of the senses that we already have, but we do need something, right? We do need something to be conscious. We can imagine that consciousness could be reduced down to something as simple as a thermostat, which is not the same thing as me saying that thermostats are conscious. I'm just simply saying that conscious systems could go down to that level of simplicity. I don't think that thermostats are conscious for the same reason that I don't think stones or rocks are conscious. I don't think that they have what it takes to create a unified subjective experience. I could be wrong. But that's how it seems to me right now. So, we've already covered part of the brain isn't conscious in its own right. We require a whole. We've looked at the simplest aspect of what consciousness could be, and we've realised that it doesn't have to be any of these senses in particular. Let's try and just go a bit further with that before we move on. The simplest consciousness that I can imagine is one that feels one of two states, maybe like dark and light. It doesn't have to be that. And when it feels one state, it does one thing. When it feels another state, it does another thing. We've got input, feeling, and output. I mean, that's all we really need for consciousness at the simplest level that I can imagine, and maybe you can do better. But when we start to think of consciousness like that, then micropsychism doesn't seem so absurd. As David Chalmers puts it, we're not suggesting that an electron is rushing around with existential angst, thinking, oh, I'm an electron, how have I got to be? I've got to be over there, or anything like that. Nothing like that. But hopefully, anyway. We had a criticism here of panpsychism. How can a rock be conscious? I think we've really addressed that. I hope you feel that way too, and if you don't, leave a comment. So, wrapping up, what have we learnt today? What have we covered? We're talking about the continued development of our understanding. Whether it's been the story of consciousness or the story of science, we continue to develop. We don't have the whole picture. We don't understand everything. There are still mysteries in both areas. But we progress, and we hopefully do a bit better all the time. In the 1990s, in our story of science, we thought that the idea of quantum mechanics going on in biological systems was ridiculous. So Max Tegmark famously said that biological systems are too warm and wet to support quantum mechanical effects, which would have been a real downer on the subject of quantum biology that's emerged since, because he was wrong, and a lot of people who agreed with him were also wrong. In plants, we have photosynthesis. Photosynthesis depends on quantum mechanics. There's other areas that we're looking into that we're not quite so completely convinced just yet, but the evidence is looking strong, where birds can see magnetic field lines. Not all birds, obviously, but some birds can. And we believe that that's a quantum mechanical effect. It looks like smell might be quantum mechanical, at least in part, as to how it works. It certainly looks like nature is quite happy to take advantage of quantum mechanical effects. And this opens up the possibility that quantum mechanics is going on in the brain, which has the potential to make things far more confusing than a simple classical understanding of neurobiology. When we look at the story of consciousness, we can see that that's progressing too. We're moving away from this idea that consciousness isn't real. Thank goodness for that. That's a relief. So, philosophers in the West now are starting to move towards some form of panpsychism as an explanation. The idea that it doesn't feel like something to be us it's absurd, and it's not. It's something that we're getting away from. We're moving away from behaviorism. We're moving away from illusionism. Good. So I just want to leave you with one last question before we finish up for this lecture, and it will lead us beautifully into the next one. And the question is, does consciousness change the physical world? So you may have some opinions on that. Might be one way, might be another. Try and justify your arguments. Think it through. We'll be getting to it. In the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed this particular lecture. Please do, if you're interested, check out the associated items and the articles. Do searches on the terms. Look at my arguments. Think about what's going on and challenge it. I don't want to spoon feed people the truth. I want to give you enough breadcrumbs for you to figure this out for yourself. And I really think there's something very serious and very real that I'm presenting to you over the course of these 4 lectures. And I have structured it in the best possible way that I can think of in order to get my points across. But I'm not trying to get masses of horses to drink the water. I'm just putting a few signs up. So, I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you very much for your attention.
Most people think consciousness is supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
We all have our own inner movie.
Consciousness is an amazing collection of sort of mundane tricks in the brain.
If nature's made of nothing but unconscious matter, how come we're conscious?
Consciousness is irreducibly subjective. Now that sense of being a subject, a locus of consciousness inside the head, is an illusion.